Hi everyone, it's Corey here from Corey's Reborns, and my dog is barking in the background. But my daughter is a month old today, and I wanted to go ahead and do her birthing story, or our birth story. Um, Before I start, I just want to say it's not a feel-good story. It's not a happy story, but you know, it's our story. So, hopefully my dog stops barking, but there's construction going around in my neighborhood, so he's barking at the construction. Um, well, yes. So the last month of my pregnancy was very, very strange. I'm just gonna get right into this. I was 34, 35 weeks pregnant when I started getting contractions, and I believe at about 35 weeks, or exactly 35 weeks, my contractions started getting so bad that they felt like I was in labor. So I worked with my mom at the time, and she was able to rush me from our job to the hospital where I was supposed to deliver. Um, and they saw that I was getting regular contractions, but I had no cervical change, which means I was not dilating. So they thought that I might have an infection, which they tested me for a UTI, but the test came out negative, so they didn't really think much of it, and they sent me home. So that led me to believe they might have been just Braxton Hicks contractions, and I didn't really think too much of it. It was painful, but again, I expect healthcare providers know what they're doing. I had a follow-up appointment with my OBGYN on the next Monday, so that happened on a Friday. So on Monday, I went to see her and I let her know what was going on, and they checked me and I was fine. And they didn't even check if I was dilating. They just said, contractions happen. So they sent me on a monitor. Again, I was having regular contractions. They didn't check for any sort of infection, but I was having contractions, and that was their suspicion. Fast forward, I got a blood test done. It was my very last blood test of the pregnancy. And when my blood test came back, my white blood cell count was very, very high. And in this time, during the last month of my pregnancy, they were checking baby's size. So, but the blood test came back, my white blood cell count was very high, but that had nothing to do with why they were checking. At 35 weeks, I was measuring 38 weeks, and then again at 36 weeks, I measured term. So I was measuring 40 weeks, and they were concerned because it had jumped from a regular with my pregnancy. So at 34 weeks, I measured 34 weeks. At 35 weeks, I measured 38. And then it just jumped to 40 weeks. And they were concerned about baby size. So they sent me, I'm sorry, I'm shaking. They sent me to get a ultrasound so they can check baby's size. And when they checked, she was measuring about 6 pounds and 12 ounces. So she was measuring pretty big for a 35 week or 36 week baby. So, again, I didn't think much of it. I just thought, she's a big baby, and my OB wasn't really too concerned because that wasn't too big. So, some weeks passed, and exactly 2 weeks later, so at 37, 36, 36, 37 weeks. Yeah. It must have been at 35 that I got the ultrasound. At 37 weeks, they rechecked her. At 38 weeks, yeah. So at 36 weeks, and then at 38 weeks. At 38 weeks, they rechecked me, and I got, again, a big measurement. So she was measuring pretty large. At 7 pounds something, 7 pounds, almost 8 pounds, like 7 pounds, 15 ounces at 37 weeks. When they initially checked me, it was the same day that I was getting those contractions. So I got the contractions. They just did an ultrasound to see if the baby was okay. That was the day that my mom took me to the emergency room. They checked her. She was 6 pounds, 12 ounces. Monday came around. They put me on a monitor. They took some blood. The next week came. So that was like at 36 weeks. That week came and my blood cell count was high. They sent me at 36 weeks to check how big she was. She was 7 pounds, 12 ounces. And then they sent me again at 38 weeks to check how big she was. And she was measuring the same, but it was a different ultrasound technician. So the first ultrasound technician was actually right. She was a very big baby. So they scheduled my induction for November 10th, Friday, November 10th. I was 39 weeks on that day. So I was scheduled to come in at 4 p.m. on Friday, November 10th, to get induced. I was scared but excited. I was ready. And I thought everything would go pretty smoothly because my body reacts to medication pretty well. So, like, I thought whatever they would use would really help me, dilate. At the time, I was only about 1 centimeter dilated and having regular contractions, but my cervix was not changing. When I got there, I was having contractions. At 4 o'clock, I was having contractions, and they didn't want to give me the Cervidil, which is used to thin out your cervix, or soften your cervix. So they didn't give it to me right away because when they attached me to the monitors, they saw that I was having regular contractions. Again, no cervical change, but my baby's heart rate was really high. So they wanted to make sure that I was not sick and I didn't have a fever or, I didn't have an infection. This might be TMI, but they checked, they asked me to give them a urine sample and they never checked it. So that should have been a red flag to me. I should have been able to say, and this is partially the reason I'm telling this horror story, I should have been saying more. But I just figured they knew what they were doing. So I should have expressed my concerns. And I did after my mom had said something about them not checking it. So I was like, hey, you guys asked me for a urine sample, but no one ever, took anything to the lab. But they didn't seem too concerned about it. And the lady kind of just tossed my urine away after like 8 hours of being there. So they set me up on the monitors and they waited till my baby's heart rate went down. I believe they gave me some sort of antibiotic because they thought I had an infection. Obviously, they didn't really care. Because the more I get into the story, the more you'll see that there was a lot of neglect or, I don't even want to use this word, but kind of like stupidity or ignorance or just I want to say malpractice going on. Finally, at about 10 o'clock at night, 9 o'clock at night, they put in the Cervidil, which looks like a plastic tampon with a string, obviously. And it's kind of like in an arrow shape. And they left that in for 12 hours to see if I would dilate more. And when they took it out, I was only 2 centimeters dilated. I was still having regular contractions and nothing was really going on. They hadn't given me any Pitocin, and I asked them, hey, are you guys going to give me like a balloon or something to make me dilate? And my OB said no. At the time, I didn't know, but there were 5 other women in the labor and delivery hall who were there to give birth. And this will make sense, and the number of women will make sense to you when I tell you what ended up happening to me. So she came in, I was 2 centimeters dilated, and she took the hook I was 2 centimeters dilated, again, 2 centimeters. So if you've been pregnant before, like, I was skeptical about it, but again, I put my trust in the medical team, and she broke my water. I hadn't been dilating. I hadn't had contractions that I could actually feel. I couldn't feel them. They weren't strong. They weren't, crazy. I wasn't screaming. I didn't have to breathe through them. It was just like I felt regular. I felt normal. So she broke my water and I felt nothing. Nothing changed. And they put me on Pitocin. I guess it went from, I don't know how the number system works for Pitocin, but they said they cranked it up to a 4. Later, they came in, they saw nothing was happening. I couldn't feel the contractions. They cranked it up to 6. A little bit later, they saw that I didn't feel anything. At this point, it was Saturday. They had broke my water at, I believe, 2 o'clock. I'm not just, I think it was 2. Let me count. So they broke my water somewhere around 1 p.m. on Saturday. So remember, I came in Friday at 4. They broke they took the Cervidil out in the morning at 10. They broke my water at 2 centimeters at 1 p.m. and started putting me on the Pitocin where I wasn't feeling anything. From 4 to 6 and then whatever. So it was 10 o'clock at night on Saturday, and they had cranked the Pitocin up to 12. I started feeling contractions. At that point, I had gotten, at 8 o'clock, when they put up my Pitocin to 10, I said, I know I'm going to start feeling these contractions, and I know that I want an epidural. I was scared. So as soon as I started feeling those contractions, I asked for the epidural. Again, 8 o'clock Saturday, I asked for the epidural, and the anesthesiologist came in. I was still 2 centimeters. I think the Pitocin was at 10 or 8. It was at 10. The level 10. I don't know how that works. So the anesthesiologist came in and gave me my first epidural, 1 of 3. There was 2 anesthesiologists. I think one of them was a student and the other one was pregnant, was 6 months pregnant, and had an IV because she had hypermesis, so she constantly was vomiting. So she was getting IV fluids and medication during her shift. So this anesthesiologist and a man came into my room. I'm feeling the contractions. It's hurting real bad. And the man gives me the epidural, and he puts in the needle crooked. So I have to get stuck again by the pregnant woman who has hypermesis. God bless her. And she gets the needle in correctly. Obviously, I was in a lot of pain. It was very hard for them. And they hooked me up. I was good for hours, I gotta say, until half of my body started feeling contractions. It was the right half. It was very painful. I was very scared. I was screaming. I was crying. So again, I got another epidural maybe at 12 o'clock at night. And at this point, I'm in utter shock. I'm in pain. I might be getting the times wrong, but I think yes. I think I'm getting the times wrong. I must have gotten my first epidural around 5. My second epidural, my first and second were around 5 and 6. And then my second one was around 8 o'clock at night. My first and second one were between 5 and 6. And my third one was at 8 o'clock. So as she did the epidural again. So the pregnant woman did the epidural again for me. And she got it. Everything's good. I stopped feeling it. But she forgot to put the medication in my IV, which is what connects to the button that, you press the button and it gives you more pain meds. She forgot to replace the bag that had been there since 5 o'clock, so there was no medication left in it. And little by little, as the hours passed, I would press the button because I was starting to feel a little bit of pain. And I realized that nothing was happening. And the more I felt pain, the more I pressed the button, and it would time out. And I'd say, I'm feeling this pain. Nothing is changing. The reason nothing was changing was because there was no medication in the bag. So for 3 hours, as the epidural wore off, I started feeling more and more and more. A lot of women do labor without an epidural and think, wow, bless you, because I was in pain. But I always heard that Pitocin makes your contractions hurt more. At this point, they had cranked me up to 14 after my third epidural to see if there would be any cervical change. Nothing was progressing. My baby was in distress. I was in pain. My husband didn't know what to do. My mom didn't know what to do. I wasn't screaming, but I tried so hard not to. I was just an intense humming. I wanted to be strong. I really did. I wanted to be strong. Not only for me, but for my family. They couldn't control it. My nurse was even upset at what was happening, because finally, when the epidural, which is when you get your epidural, they initially give you medication, and then they walk out and they give you like a little IV bag where you press the button. Since they forgot to fill that, as the epidural wore off, everything was getting more painful. And when it was completely worn off, it had to have been like 3 a.m. or something 2 something in the morning, and I was screaming, and there was nothing anyone can do because there was only one anesthesiologist left, and she, the pregnant woman, at 2:30 in the morning was doing a C-section. So I'm screaming for pain meds and no one can give me any of them. My nurse couldn't give them to me. She can see them. She could physically see them, but she couldn't give them to me. She said if I was her daughter, she'd be livid. At this point, my baby has been inside of me with no amniotic fluid for hours. More than 10, I believe. Finally, the first C-section of the night by my OBGYN is finished. And they came in, and instead of giving me another epidural, they realized that my baby's in distress and they need to do an emergency C-section. And I remember just bawling my eyes out. Not because I had to get a C-section, just because I knew that my C-section would take recovery time, and it was time that I couldn't spend with my daughter. I knew that if my epidural didn't work, then they might have to put me to sleep. I knew that when she came out of me, I wouldn't be the first thing she saw. I mean, it was very painful for me. Everything just happened so fast. I had a really high fever. Her heart rate was up. I was in pain. Just everything just kind of smacked me in the face. I knew I wouldn't get to do skin to skin with her if they were sewing me back together. I was just hurt. That's something that I thought would be so beautiful, that should be so beautiful, kind of turned into a miniature disaster for me. And it could have been much worse. I understand that. But for me, this was horrifying. To get a major surgery and just, something you weren't expecting. You just wanted everything to be perfect because everybody wants the day that their child comes to be perfect. So at this point, my mom had already left and she went home. And my husband called her and she rushed over. They took me into the room to give me my C-section. They were administering pain medication and they told me, if you can still feel it, we're not going to let your husband in because we're going to have to put you in general anesthesia and he can't come in. And at the time, I felt like it was almost a threat. Like, oh, if you tell me you can still feel this, then, your husband's not going to get to be here for the birth of his daughter. And that hurt me. I was scared. I was petrified. All I could think was, she's not going to see any of us when she comes out. She's not going to see any of us. So they gave me the pain medication, and I was exhausted from just the contractions, from the hours of labor, of artificial labor, just everything. Everything was just happening so fast. My husband came in. I asked for him. He was there. And as they were doing the C-section, I didn't feel much. Just a little bit of pressure. And then I heard her cry. When she came out. And I smiled and I cried too a little bit. But I was like in a trance. I felt like I was asleep. I felt like it wasn't real. As they were sewing me back together, I started saying, "It's stinging. Am I supposed to feel it stinging?" And they came over and put a gas mask on me, and what was probably 30 minutes felt like 2 minutes to me, and they put me under. My husband grabbed her, and they put me under so crazily that, like, they explained it to my husband that it was like an artificial coma almost. Like, she's done. She's not going to wake up. So my husband grabs our baby, and he walks her over to me, and he tells me that she started to cry while he was holding her near me. And I opened my eyes and I asked, "Is she okay? Is she okay?" He's like, "Yes, she's okay, honey. Go back to sleep." And that's what happened. I woke up after out of general anesthesia because I heard my baby cry. So they wheeled me out, and they rushed my baby girl to the NICU. They put me in the recovery room. I had 102 fever. They didn't know what was wrong. They told me I was sepsis. That I had sepsis, so it's kind of bacterial, like a poisoning of the blood almost, but in bacterial form. I'm very familiar with it because I get a lot of UTIs. I have really bad kidneys, so I'm really familiar with being sepsis. It's very dangerous and it's very scary, but I've been through it before, so I was okay with it. Then came the news. I can hear other women in other rooms with their babies. I didn't have my baby. And I wasn't going to be able to see my baby until I didn't have a fever. And I had to be without a fever for 24 hours. It was devastating. It was painful. It was scary. It didn't feel natural. It didn't feel right. I almost felt like they took my baby from me and they were never going to give her back. It was the worst day of my life. It was. And to break my fever, my husband went home to walk the dogs, and I told him to bring some Ziploc bags, and we filled them with ice, and we covered my body in these Ziploc bags to break the fever. And finally, my fever was gone after hours and hours, and I didn't get to see my baby until like 8 o'clock at night, I believe Monday. And she was born at 5:15 in the morning on Sunday. So she had been 16 hours in my womb without amniotic fluid. What I thought would take a couple of days, or I thought she was going to be in the NICU until I was able to have her, was not the case. But you'll find out the rest of the story in the next part of this video. Thanks for watching. Bye-bye.